802.1x is a lot more complicated to troubleshoot because there's multiple points of failures. 802.1x is a port-based access control standard that defines an authorization framework, which includes the supplicant, the authentication server, and the AP, which is your authenticator. It also integrates with LDAP. Now, the protocol that is used with on this authorization framework is called EAP, Extensible Authentication Framework, and that protocol is used between the supplicant and the radius server. And the better flavors of 802.1x EAP require certificates, a root certificate that needs to be distributed and installed on the client, as well as a server-side certificate. And actually, one of the biggest challenges with 802.1x is how you're going to get that root certificate onto the client. The whole point of 802.1x is to set up a TLS tunnel between the client and the radius server, and this is known as tunneled authentication. So the authentication process can occur inside that tunnel. Now you can see this is pretty complex, and because it's so complex, there's multiple points of failure. Aerohive has a tool called Client Monitor that can help you identify a lot of these points of failures. If, for example, you see that your radius server cannot, that a client AP cannot reach the radius server, it's probably a back-end problem. If you're unable to reach the radius servers, things like problems in the back end could be a shared secret mismatch, incorrect settings on either the AP or the radius server, an authentication port mismatch. That is, usually we're using ports 1812 and 1813. Sometimes ports 1645 and 1646 are used. And a lot of times an error on the back end that doesn't occur, that a lot of people don't think about, is the communications between the radius server and your LDAP server. If that goes down, the whole system fails. But usually the back end problem, the first thing you should suspect is a shared secret mismatch. Once again, if it's a back-end problem, the problem is going to be a shared secret mismatch between the AP and the radius server. It could be incorrect IP settings on the AP or radius server. It could be an authentication port mismatch between the AP or the radius server, or it could be an LDAP communications between the radius server and your LDAP server. Now, if the problem is not a back-end problem, and you can determine that, and the radius server is responding properly, the problem is more than likely going to be on the supplicant, the client. The Client Monitor, Aerohive's troubleshooting tool, can actually show you whether or not an SSL tunnel has been set up. If the SSL tunnel hasn't been set up, what do you think the problem is? Certificates. So if the SSL tunnel fails, you have a certificate problem. Could be an expired certificate. The root certificate could be installed in the wrong store of the client or the laptop. You could have incorrect clock settings. Always remember that client certificates are time-based. Another client-side problem that might be causing problems with this is mismatched EAP types. What other problems could be caused at a client side that might not necessarily be certificate based? Well, it could be an expired username or user account. Could be a wrong passwords being typed in for 802.1x authentication. The user could not exist in your LDAP server, or you might have a misconfiguration in terms of user authentication versus machine authentication.